Perek HaMoicher Asfina Daf Pei, sponsored Refuah Shlema for Shalom Aron ben Chana. We begin with the Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses how a purchaser acquires merchandise sold to him. Number one, a seller and buyer agree on the price, let's say per kilo. The buyer performed a mashicha in a simta, an area off the public thoroughfare designated for commerce, or in a chatzar shel shutfin, a jointly owned property. He acquires even before the merchandise is measured. However, if they did not agree on a price, he does not acquire. The Gemara brings a machlokes Rav Asi and Rav Zera how the buyer acquires without a mashicha. Rav Asi stated in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the seller measured and then poured it on the floor of a simta. The buyer has legal rights to it as his domain, acquiring by a kinyan chatzar. Rav Zera understood Rabbi Yochanan as saying he acquired only when he poured it into the buyer's vessel, since it is his exclusive domain. In a public domain, both agree the buyer cannot acquire since he has no right to place it there. However, he can acquire by performing a mashicha from a public domain to a simta. The utensil of a buyer acquires in any place, he has right to set it down. Not only in a simta or a property jointly owned, but even on the property of the seller, as long as the seller permits him to place it there. However, in a public domain or in the domain of a third party without permission, his utensil cannot acquire. Number two, second law of the Mishnah is where one measured without performing a mashicha, he does not acquire. This refers to the seller. But the buyer measuring is a hagbah, an acquisition by lifting. Also, the use of his utensil for measuring or storing acquires for him even without a mashicha. The Gemara quotes a long brisa that explains different points of acquisition depending on whose utensil and where it is situated. Number one, the measuring device belongs to a third party. The contents belong to the seller until it is full. Number two, the measuring device belongs to the seller. The contents are his until the buyer acquires. If the buyer's, any amount belongs to the buyer as soon as the seller begins pouring. Number three, the measuring device is in the seller's domain. The buyer acquires by lifting or pulling it into some area belonging to him. In the buyer's domain, as soon as the seller agrees to the sale, it is his. Number four, a third party's domain, the buyer either receives permission from him to acquire or rents it. The Gemara discusses a case where the buyer's utensil is in the seller's domain. The Gemara rejects a proof from a woman who acquires her get on her husband's property. Number one, Shmuel explains she acquires because her sewing basket was hanging from her. She acquired by hagbah. Number two, Reish Lakish explains she acquires because it is tied to her, even resting on the ground because it moves with her. Number three, Rav Ada explains she acquires because the basket is between her legs. Her husband grants her rights where she sits. Number four, Rav Misharshi explains the husband sells baskets and hers was in the store used for nothing else. 5. Rabbi Yochanan explains the husband is not particular about where she sits or places her sewing basket. The Gemara concludes if the merchandise was placed in the buyer's utensil immediately after their agreement, it acquires even in the seller's domain. If you're enjoying Daf and 5, please click on the link below, subscribe, and become a sponsor. Have a good Zimmer. Have a wonderful spring and summer.